Welcome to Mystic Dragon Chronicles, where every tale holds a lesson. Beyond fantasy, lesson that last. Let's step into the story.
The forest on Varan 5 smelled like wet copper and pine. Reed had never figured out why. Something in the soil, maybe. Something in the trees that were not quite trees. He had been walking through it for 3 hours, and the smell had soaked into his clothes and hair, and he had stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing things that are always there. He was not supposed to be in Sector 9 Green. His scan route ended at the ridge. Everything past the ridge was unlogged terrain, marked on the company map with a small yellow symbol that meant, not your problem yet. Reed climbed the ridge anyway. It was faster than going around. He reached the top and stopped. Below him, through the canopy, a column of thin gray smoke rose from the tree-line. Not campfire smoke. The kind that comes from something that burned fast and hot and was now cooling. His scanner buzzed before he even raised it. 2 heat signatures, one large and barely moving, one small and frantic, both clustered near a shape half buried in the trees that his scanner identified, after a moment, as the hull of a small transport vessel. Reed stood there. He looked at the smoke. He looked at his scanner. He looked at the route back to base camp, which was clear and safe and exactly where he was supposed to be going. He filed an anomaly report with the company. That was the protocol. Report. Don't engage. Let the proper teams handle it. Then he stood there for another 30 seconds. Then he started walking down the ridge toward the smoke. He told himself it was just to get a better look. The forest floor was soft and wet, and his boots sank into it with every step. The wreck got clearer as he moved closer. A small private transport, the kind families used for inter-colony travel, split open along the belly like something had punched through it from the outside. The cargo bay doors were gone. Scorch marks ran along the left side in long diagonal lines. Reed had seen crash damage before. He had not seen whatever made those marks before. He slowed down when he heard the sound. It was low, rhythmic, like something trying very hard to keep a steady breath, but not quite managing it. He checked his field guide, scrolling through Varan 5 fauna entries. Nothing matched. The sound was not in any database he had access to. He pushed through the last line of underbrush and stopped for the second time that afternoon. The hatchling was small, maybe the size of a large dog, if the dog had wings that were too big for its body and scales the color of old gold shot through with green. It was standing over something. Something larger, something that was not moving, something that had the same scale pattern but bigger, and there was dark fluid soaking into the moss beneath it. The hatchling saw Reed the same moment he saw her. She moved fast. 1 second she was pressed against the larger dragon's side. The next she was between Reed and the body, wings spread as wide as they could go, which was wider than he expected. Her silver eyes were fixed on him. Her whole body was shaking. Reed did not move. She hissed. It was not a small sound. It came from somewhere deep in her chest, and it bounced off the trees and made the birds overhead go quiet. Then she snapped at the air in front of her, a warning, not an attack. She did not move forward. She did not run. She held her ground. Reed crouched down. Slowly. He kept his hands open at his sides. He had no idea if that meant anything to her. He did it anyway. He looked past her at the larger dragon. Juvenile, not yet adult. Longer legs, broader skull than the hatchling, but the same coloring. There was a wound across the wing joint and down the ribs. The dark fluid was blood. The larger dragon's chest was rising and falling, but the rhythm was wrong. Too shallow, too fast. Reed did the math quietly in his head. The sun was already past the midpoint. Temperature on Varan 5 dropped sharply after dark. The larger dragon was losing blood. Without help, the math ended one way. He sat down on the ground. All the way down, cross-legged in the mud, making himself as small as a grown man in survey gear could reasonably make himself. He put his scanner away. He folded his hands in his lap. The hatchling stared at him. He started talking. He did not say anything important. He talked about the smell of the forest, about the anomaly report he had filed, about how his colleague Orn was going to be furious that he was 2 hours late checking in. He kept his voice low and even. He did not look directly at her eyes for more than a second at a time. She kept shaking. She did not attack. She did not move away from the body behind her. After a long time, long enough that the shadows moved, she stopped hissing. Reed kept talking. She watched him with silver eyes that did not look like the eyes of an animal. They looked like the eyes of someone who had run out of options and was trying very hard to figure out if this new strange thing was one more threat or something else entirely. Reed understood that look. He stayed where he was. There is a particular kind of patience that has nothing to do with being calm. It is the kind where you are not calm at all, where your legs are going numb from sitting on wet ground and your mind is running through every bad outcome in order, and you stay still anyway, because moving is the one thing you cannot do. Reed had been sitting in the mud for 2 hours. The hatchling, he had started thinking of her as just her, which was not very professional but was accurate, had not attacked him. She had also not moved more than a meter from the body behind her. She watched Reed the way prey watches a predator it has decided, for now, to wait on. Every time he shifted even slightly, her wings lifted. He shifted very rarely. He tried the radio at the 90-minute mark. He kept his voice flat and quiet, barely above a murmur, because he did not want to startle her. "Oren, you there?" Static. Then, Reed. "You were supposed to check in an hour ago. Where are you?" "Sector 9 green. Past the ridge." A pause. "That's not on your route." "I know." "Reed. I need you to look something up for me. Veldara species. Medical needs. Wound treatment. Anything you've got." The pause this time was longer. "Why?" "Because there's a juvenile one bleeding in front of me and a hatchling who hasn't let me get close enough to do anything useful." Oren said several things after that. Reed listened to all of them. When Oren finished, Reed said, "Also, can you check drift crew activity in this sector? The crash site has those diagonal scorch marks along one side." This pause was the longest. When Oren spoke again, his voice had changed. "Those marks are plasma cuts, Reed. That shuttle was shot down." "I thought so." "The drift crew ran a sweep through Sector 7 last week. We reported it to Colonial Security, and Colonial Security said they'd look into it." "Did they?" "What do you think?" Reed looked at the hatchling. She was watching him with her head tilted slightly to one side, like she was trying to understand what the noise coming out of him meant. "They'll come back," he said, "to the crash site, to finish the salvage. Reed, you need to leave. The juvenile will be dead before dark if no one helps. That is not your problem." Reed looked at the hatchling again. She had gone back to pressing herself against the larger dragon's side while still keeping her eyes on Reed, sharing warmth. She was not big enough to do much, but she was doing what she could with what she had. "Can you find a Veldara healer anywhere in the colony settlement?" he said. "Anything in the registry." Oren made a sound like a man being asked to do something he already knew he was going to do. "I'll look. I'm not promising anything, and I want it on record that this is entirely your choice, and I have advised against it." "Noted." "You're still not leaving, are you?" "I'll radio in an hour." He put the comm down and looked at the wound. He could see it more clearly now that the light had shifted, a deep gash starting at the wing joint and running down across the ribs. The blood had slowed, which was either good or very bad depending on why it had slowed. The juvenile's breathing was still shallow. Its eyes had not opened once in 2 hours. Reed opened his med kit. Basic field kit, wound seal, fever tabs, 2 bandage rolls. Nothing designed for a species he had never treated. He did not know if the wound seal would even bond to Veldara scales. He did not know if moving closer would undo everything he had built in the last 2 hours. He put the kit on the ground in front of him, open, visible, and did not reach for it. The hatchling looked at the kit, then at Reed, then at the kit again. He waited. After a while she made a sound he had not heard from her before. Not the hiss, not the keening cry. Something quieter. It was almost conversational in tone, like she was telling him something. Like she was explaining a situation he clearly did not understand. He said, "I know. I'm working on it." She made the sound again. Then she turned and pushed her nose gently against the juvenile's neck and held it there. That was when Reed understood that she was not just scared. She knew what was happening. She understood that the large dragon beside her was getting worse, and she had been standing over him for how long? Since the crash. Maybe longer. She had been doing the only thing she could do, which was stay. Reed had done harder things than wait. He could not think of one right now, but he was certain he had. His radio buzzed. Oren's voice came back quiet and unhappy. "There's one name in the registry. A Dr. Naila. Veldara species, medical license, resident in the South Colony settlement. She's been there 6 years, and by all accounts, she does not welcome visitors. Can you reach her? I already called. She said no. Reed said nothing. Oren sighed. I told her what you told me. About the hatchling. A pause. She said she'd come. The sun dropped another degree toward the treeline. Somewhere to the west, past the ridge, something cracked, a branch, heavy and sudden. Not the wind. Reed's hand moved to his flare gun before he had decided to move it. The hatchling heard it too. Her wings came up. 4 of them. Reed counted through the gaps in the trees before they saw him. 4, moving in a loose spread, armed with short-range plasma cutters and one longer rifle slung across the back of the biggest one. They moved like people who had done this before, efficient, quiet, no wasted steps. They were headed straight for the wreck. Reed radioed Oren. For incoming. Drift crew, I think. Arm. Get out of there. Can't. Reed. How far out is the doctor? A pause. An hour. Maybe more. An hour. Reed looked at the hatchling. She had heard the footsteps too. Her whole body had gone rigid, wings pulled tight, eyes fixed west. She was not looking at Reed anymore. She had found a bigger threat, and she had locked onto it with everything she had. The juvenile had not moved. Reed stood up. He brushed the mud off his knees, which was a pointless thing to do, and he stepped out from behind the tree he had been using as a backrest, and he walked toward the wreck until he was standing in the small clear space between the crash site and the treeline. He put his flare gun in his hand, held loose at his side. The drift crew came through the trees and stopped. The one in front was not the biggest, but he walked like he was. Lean and unhurried, with close-cut hair and the kind of face that had learned not to show much. He looked at Reed. He looked at the wreck behind Reed. He looked at the 2 dragons. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did the math very fast. You're in a restricted salvage zone, he said. His common speech was flat and accented. Clear out. Reed said. The shuttle was carrying registered passengers. That makes it a crash site, not a salvage zone. The man, Ras, Reed would learn later, not that it mattered much, tilted his head. You a lawyer? Survey tech. I've already transmitted coordinates to Colonial Security. Reed kept his voice even. It was not entirely a lie. He had transmitted them. Colonial Security had not responded yet, but that was a detail. And I've put in a formal contact request to the Veldara consulate on Mirren Station. They tend to take an interest when their young are involved. Ras looked at the dragons again. A hatchling was worth a great deal. Reed knew that. Ras knew Reed knew that. The silence between them was a negotiation conducted entirely without words. Then one of the crew, young, impatient, making his first real mistake, stepped sideways and started moving around the edge of the clearing toward the dragons. The hatchling moved. She was the size of a dog. She had no fire, no venom, no size advantage. She crossed the distance between herself and the crew member in under 2 seconds, and she was in front of him before he could process that she had moved at all. Her wings were fully spread. Her head was low. She made a sound that was not the hiss Reed had heard before. This was something deeper, something that came from the chest and resonated in a frequency that Reed felt in his back teeth. The crew member stopped. Then he stepped back. Then he stepped back again. Then he turned and walked very quickly toward the treeline and did not stop. 2 of the remaining 3 had their hands on their weapons. Ras had not moved. Reed raised the flare gun and pointed it at the canopy directly above the crash site. He waited 1 second to make sure everyone understood what he was pointing at. The forest above the wreck was dry. 3 weeks without rain, dead leaves banked up against the hull. I've got a medical team coming in on my coordinates, Reed said. If you're still here when they arrive, that's a colonial incident report with your faces attached. He kept looking at Ras. And if anyone touches those dragons, I'll make enough smoke that security will find this site by sight from 40 kilometers out. And that's before the Veldara consulate gets involved. Ras was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved from Reed to the hatchling to the flare gun to the juvenile lying in the moss. Then back to Reed. You'd burn yourself out too, Ras said. Probably not, but I'm willing to find out. The math changed. Reed could see it happening. 1 human and a hatchling were manageable. Coordinates already transmitted were a problem. An incoming medical team was a bigger problem. A Veldara diplomatic flag was a problem that could follow you for years. Ras clicked something at the side of his jaw. A calm he said 3 words Reed did not catch. Then he looked at Reed one last time with the expression of a man filing something away for later, and he turned and walked back into the trees. The other two followed. Reed waited until he could no longer hear footsteps. Then he lowered the flare gun and shot the flare sideways into the wet mud, where it fizzled out uselessly, because there had been no plan beyond the bluff, and some part of him had known that from the start. He turned around. The hatchling was standing 3 feet behind him. She had left the juvenile. She had crossed the clearing and come to stand behind Reed while he was facing down 4 armed crew members, and he had not heard her move. She looked up at him. She made a sound, the quiet one, the almost conversational one. Reed let out a long breath. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." She walked back to the juvenile and lay down against his side. After a moment, she looked back at Reed over her shoulder. He came and sat down beside them, close enough, this time, that his shoulder was almost against her wing. She did not move away. Dr. Naila arrived in the dark. She came with Oren, who was carrying a portable light and a medical case, and the expression of someone who had made peace with the situation and did not have to like it. Naila carried nothing. She walked ahead of Oren through the trees like she already knew where she was going, which Reed thought was strange until she got close enough for him to see her eyes. Veldara eyes, silver like the hatchlings, and right now they were fixed on the 2 dragons with an expression he could not read. She was smaller than Reed expected, older. Her scales had that faded look at the edges, the green going pale where it met the gold, the way old paint goes at the corners of things. She moved quietly, and she had not said a word since she cleared the treeline. She stopped about 4 meters out and looked at the hatchling. The hatchling looked back. Reed braced himself. He had spent hours earning the few inches of space he had. He had no idea what a Veldara doctor arriving meant to a Veldara hatchling whose brother was unconscious and whose last several hours had included a pirate crew and a strange human who would not leave. Naila did not move toward them. She stood where she was, and she spoke. Reed did not understand the words. They were low and rounded, the kind of sounds that felt like they had been shaped over a long time, worn smooth with use. But it was the voice itself that surprised him. It was rough, like someone reading from a book they had not opened in years. Like the language itself had stiffened from not being used. The hatchling went very still. Naila kept talking. Short sentences. Pauses between them. Reed watched the hatchling's wings, which had been half raised since Naila arrived, and he watched them come down. Not all the way, but enough. Oren appeared at Reed's shoulder. "What is she saying?" Reed said quietly. "I have no idea," Oren said. "I don't speak Veldarin." They waited. After a while, Naila turned to Reed. "She needs to understand why I am here." Her common speech was careful and accented. In our custom, a healer does not approach without being asked. She did not ask, so I must make it clear that I come without a claim. "Without a claim," Reed said. "We do not heal in exchange for things. It is considered wrong. She needs to know that I am here only because he needs help. Nothing else. No debt." Reed looked at the hatchling. "How do you show that?" Naila said, "You kneel." And then she lowered herself, unhurriedly, to the ground in front of the hatchling. The hatchling stared at her for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. Naila worked with a stillness that Reed found difficult to watch because it required so much attention and he was tired. She cleaned the wound carefully. She used things from her case that Reed could not identify. She spoke to the juvenile in the same low, worn, smooth voice she had used on the hatchling, even though he was unconscious and could not hear her, and Reed understood that this was not for the juvenile's benefit but for the hatchling's, so that she could hear every movement explained before it happened. The hatchling sat at the juvenile's head and watched every move Naila made. She did not interfere. Once, when Naila's hands paused over the wound, when the doctor went still for a few seconds in a way that was not professional stillness, but something else, something older, the hatchling made a soft sound. Just one. Quiet, like a question. Naila's hand steadied. She kept working. Reed watched that. He filed it away somewhere. Near the middle of the night, when the worst of it was done and the juvenile's breathing had shifted into something more regular, Naila came and sat near Reed. Not close. She looked at the moss between them. "He will need proper rest," she said. "Several weeks. The infection was beginning. I have treated it, but he should not be moved for at least 2 days." Reed nodded. Naila was quiet for a moment. Then, why did you stay? Reed thought about it. I don't know exactly. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. That is a very Veldara thing to say. She paused. We say that the actions which cannot be explained are usually the ones that cannot be argued with. Reed looked at the hatchling. She had not slept. She was pressed against the juvenile's flank, her eyes still open, but her wings were down and her breathing was slow. She looked, for the first time since Reed had found her, like something other than a creature in crisis. She looked tired. Just tired. Oren came over and dropped a folded heat sheet next to Reed, without saying anything. He went back to his post at the edge of the clearing. Naila stood. I will stay until morning. She said it like a statement of fact, not an offer. The wound must be checked in a few hours. Thank you, Reed said. She looked at him for a moment with those silver eyes. Then she walked back to check the juvenile's temperature and did not respond, which Reed decided to take as acknowledgement. He pulled the heat sheet around his shoulders and leaned his back against the wreck hull. The metal was cold. The forest was dark and quiet except for the small sounds of the night things. The hatchling's eyes, half open now, caught the faint light. She was still watching, not with fear this time. Reed was not sure what to call what it was instead. He pulled the heat sheet a little tighter and did not look away, and after a while she closed her eyes all the way. He stayed awake another hour just to be sure. By morning the juvenile still had not opened his eyes, but his color was better. Reed did not know enough about Veldara biology to know what better color looked like, but Naila said it, and she said it with something approaching relief, which he decided to trust. Colonial Security had responded to Reed's coordinates sometime in the early hours with a message that said they had logged the incident and would dispatch a team. Estimated arrival, 6 to 8 hours. It was the kind of response that meant they were coming, just not urgently. Reed sent a follow-up noting the drift crew activity and received an automated acknowledgement. So they were on their own for a while longer. He reported this to the group without editorializing. Oren said, "Wonderful," and went to check the perimeter. The morning passed quietly. Naila tended to the juvenile's wound. The hatchling watched and occasionally touched her nose to the juvenile's cheek and pulled back, like she was checking something. Reed ate the last of his ration bar and split the water between himself and Oren and did not mention to either of them that his arm had started to ache from where he had braced himself against the hull all night. Ras came back at mid-morning. He did not come alone. 6 of them this time, through the east side of the tree line, and 2 of them had proper rifles. He had made some calls in the night. He had done his own math and arrived at a different answer. He stopped at the edge of the clearing. He looked at the group. 1 human, 1 amphibian, 1 Veldara doctor, 2 dragons. He looked at it like a man reviewing an invoice he did not agree with. Colonial law, he said. Paragraph 9, resource and salvage provisions. An unregistered vessel in uncharted terrain with no surviving claimant on record constitutes open salvage. He said it flat, like he was reading from somewhere. These creatures have no registration on Varan 5. That makes them unregistered bioassets. Naila stepped forward before Reed could speak. She was smaller than Ras. She stood in front of him like size was an irrelevant fact. I am Dr. Naila of the Veldara Medical Registry. Her voice was no longer rough. It was very clear. I am placing a formal medical claim on these patients under Interstellar Medical Code, Article 3, which predates colonial salvage law by 4 centuries and supersedes it under the Mirren Convention. She held up her comm. This is being recorded and transmitted to the Veldara Registry Office on Mirren Station in real time. Ras's jaw tightened slightly. Ras looked at Reed. Reed said, "She's not wrong." The standoff held for a moment. Reed could see Ras calculating. The legal exposure, the diplomatic risk, the time it would take security to arrive against the time it would take what he wanted and be gone. The numbers were close. Close enough that one of his crew stopped waiting for the math to finish. The shot came from the left. It caught Reed across the outer arm. Not a full hit, a graze from a plasma cutter on low setting, but it burned and it knocked him sideways, and he went down onto one knee. He heard Oren shout something. He heard the short, dense crack of a survey charge going off, and then a very large amount of noise from the west side of the clearing as Oren's controlled detonation took out a section of dead timber and filled the air with smoke and sound. Then something else happened. The juvenile opened his eyes. He was slow about it. He blinked twice. He seemed to take in the scene. The smoke, the shouting, Naila standing rigid in the middle of the clearing, the hatchling pressed against his side, Reed on one knee with his hand over his arm. He could not stand properly. He got his front legs under him, and that was as far as it went. But he pulled his head up, and he breathed in, and he opened his mouth. The sound that came out was not an adult roar. He was too young and too hurt for that. But it was the shape of one. It had the architecture of what an adult roar would be. The low resonance, the frequency that rattled in your chest. It lasted 3 seconds, and when it stopped the clearing was completely silent. Ras left, not running, walking fast, with his people, back into the trees, and this time Reed did not think they were coming back. Reed sat down the rest of the way. Oren appeared beside him and looked at the arm and said several things in his own language that Reed suspected were not complimentary. Naila was already moving toward Reed with her medical case. The juvenile lowered his head back to the ground, exhausted by those 3 seconds, and the hatchling made a sound that Reed had not heard before, something bright and short, almost like relief. Colonial security arrived 19 minutes later to a clearing that had smoke damage, a section of collapsed timber, 2 dragons, a Veldara doctor in the middle of a recorded transmission, an amphibian with a survey charge detonator, and Reed sitting against the wreck hull with a bandaged arm and an expression that the security officer later described in her report as untroubled, given the circumstances. She asked him what had happened. Reed said, "Survey anomaly. I stopped to check it out." She looked at all of it. She wrote things down. She did not look like she believed him entirely, but she wrote it down. 3 weeks passed. Reed went back to work. He filed his incident report, got his arm properly treated, and received a formal note from the company thanking him for the anomaly coordinates and quietly reminding him that survey technicians were not first responder personnel. He wrote a short reply acknowledging the note. He did not change anything about how he worked. He heard secondhand that the juvenile, whose name, he was told by Naila in a brief comm message, was Davin, had been moved to the Colony Medical Center and was recovering well. The hatchling, Sori, had refused to leave the medical center for the first 5 days and had eventually been given a space near his bed, which the staff had arranged with blankets and apparently some negotiation. He heard that a Veldara family delegation was en route from Seraph. He did not go to the medical center. He told himself there was no reason to. They had their doctor, their family coming, colonial security running a case against the drift crew. Everything was handled. His part was done. He believed this for about a week. Then Oren sent him a message that said only, "Delegation arrives tomorrow. Colony Hall, mid-morning. You should come." And then, after a pause in the message, "Don't make me say it twice." Reed went. The Colony Hall was the largest building in the settlement, which in a settlement this size meant it could comfortably hold 30 people before it became uncomfortable. It was holding about 40 when Reed arrived, which included the colonial administrator, 2 security officers, Naila standing to one side, looking like she had dressed for an occasion she was ambivalent about, and a Veldara delegation of 4 adults who filled the room differently than the humans and lion and other species present. Not aggressively, just significantly. They were large and old, and they moved with the particular ease of people who had never had reason to make themselves small. Davin stood with them. He was thinner than he should have been, and he held his injured wings slightly off from his body, but he was standing. He found Reed almost immediately when Reed came through the door, and he watched him cross the room with an expression Reed could not read. The family elder spoke. Naila translated in a low voice at Reed's shoulder, appearing there without Reed noticing she had moved. The words were formal, old formal, the kind that had specific weight. The elder said that a life given back was not a thing that could be paid, that the Veldara did not use the word debt for what this was because debt implied a transaction, and a transaction implied equals exchanging something of value, and what Reed had given was not something that could be valued on a scale. She said that they would remember. She said it the way you say something that will still be true in 100 years. Reed did not entirely know what to say. He said, he would have done the same. Naila translated this. The elder looked at him for a moment with silver eyes. Then she said something short. Naila said, quietly, she says yes. That is why it matters that you did. Reed stood there and took that in. Then something crossed the room. Sori came through the gathered adults and the colonial staff like water finding a gap, small and quick and entirely unbothered by anyone she passed. She crossed the floor and stopped in front of Reed. She had grown. Not much. 3 weeks was not long. But something about her was different. The frantic quality was gone. The shaking was gone. She looked up at him with silver eyes that were steady and calm. She sat down. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his hand. It was a brief contact, deliberate and careful. Then she straightened. Reed looked at Naila. Soul present, Naila said. Her voice was quiet. It means, there is not a good translation. It is not family. It is not a debt holder. It is someone whose absence would be felt. Someone whose presence changes the shape of things. She paused. It is not a thing Veldara say easily or quickly. A hatchling naming someone's soul present is. It is not a small thing. Reed looked at Sori. She was watching him with the same patience she had shown in that clearing when he had first sat down in the mud and started talking. The same quality of waiting that was not passive but very deliberate. He crouched down to her level, the same way he had that first afternoon. He said, "You take care of him." She held eye contact for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back across the room to Davin and stood beside him and did not look back. She did not need to. Reed straightened up. Oren appeared at his elbow, as he had a habit of doing. "You know they'll come back," he said. "Someday. Veldara, don't forget." "I know." "That doesn't bother you?" Reed thought about a hatchling in the dark, wings spread, shaking, standing over a body and refusing to move an inch. He thought about the sound she had made that he could not find in any database. He thought about sitting in the mud talking about nothing until she stopped flinching. "No," he said. Oren looked at him sideways. "You're a strange person, Reed." "Probably," Reed said. "You coming? I've got a scan route to finish." Oren said several things about the scan route and Reed's priorities and the general recklessness of survey technicians who did not stay on their routes. He said all of it while following Reed out of the colony hall and into the cool morning air of Varan 5, which still smelled like wet copper and pine. Reed breathed it in. He had stopped noticing it a long time ago. Today, for some reason, he noticed it.